When we introduced the author class, we showed how we can create instances, read attributes, and update attributes. Now we want to take this one step further for the entry class, where we also want these create, read, and update behaviors, but we want to define our own behavior as well by introducing a method that calculates the length of the headline and the body taken together. And to start this, we introduce a new class called entry. We, from the get-go this time, define the adder accessors, and we know which attributes we want. We want the author, headline, body, and date attributes. And we define an initialize method that sets the various attributes to their initial values. Note that I'm initializing the date parameter here with time.now. This is a call to the now method of the time object from the standard library, which gives me the current time and date, which I store in the date variable. On the next line, you see an example of multiple assignment where we take values author, headline, body, and date, and assign them simultaneously to the instance variables @author, @headline, @body, and @date. So in the IRB, I have defined the entry class as far as we've defined it so far. You see here the adder accessor call for the author, headline, body, and date attributes, and the initialize method, which takes as its first parameter an author, and I have not used default values here for the author because I want the author to be specified on each initialization of the entry class. And you can also see that I'm using time.now to create or initialize the date parameter here. Let's create an entry, entry.new. And now I have to give an author, and what I want it to be, of course, is an author instance or author object. So I can choose to use Bilbo here, which I've initialized earlier. And as the headline, I can say hello. And as the body text, welcome from the Shire. Now notice that I did not give a date because the default parameter here initializes it for us. And so we see here now again a new object of class entry with its own object ID here. And we have the author attribute initialized to be Bilbo. So we see that the object is really here. And we have the headline, the body, and the date in a specific format initialized. Our next task is to actually add this mechanism to compute the length of headline and body taken together for any one entry object. And so what we want is if we create two entries, E1 and E2 say, so E1 has the headline there and the body text ... and ... and E2 has the headline ... back ... and the body ... again ... then we want E1's length to come out as 14 and E2's length come out as 21. So the question is, how can we accomplish this? And in Ruby, we have actually two options, unlike in Java. In Ruby, we could create a method called length, and we give it an entry object, and we could define this method length independent from any one class in a module. Let's say a module of helper functions. And the benefit of this would be that the methods would be independent from the data they process. They just receive the entry object as a parameter. But it also means that these methods would have to know how an entry works, what its attributes are, and how to get to them. And so the second option we have is to create an instance method of the entry class, much like you would do it in Java. And the benefit here clearly is the proximity to the data structure itself. But the sort of downside is that the behavior of your application is now scattered across multiple classes. So rather than having, let's say, all helper functions together in one place, you now have them scattered across a multitude of classes. And which of these two options you choose depends largely on how you want to structure your application. So let's briefly look at each of them, how they turn out in terms of the code. On the left-hand side here, you see that I have defined a module called helpers. And I've defined in the module a method called length. It takes an entry. And then I use my knowledge about what an entry looks like, and I identify the headline attribute in the entry, and I identify the body attribute in the entry. Both I assume to be strings, and so I can call their length methods and simply add those up, and that gives me the length of the entire entry. If I, on the other hand, define a method, an instance method in the class, then I reopen my entry class like I did before. I define my method, and now I have direct access to the attribute headline, or the instance variable headline here, as well as to the body. And so I don't have to follow through a separate level of indirection to get to my values. And again, I use length on both of the strings that I've stored in headline and body. So let's try to understand where the benefits and downsides of each of these approaches are. If we define this in a separate module of helpers, we can reuse the same method length for anything that has a headline and a body. It doesn't matter whether this is an entry as we've defined it, let's say in the class definition here, or any other data structure, as long as it has an attribute headline and an attribute body, we can work with it. Now, on the other hand side, if we primarily use the length method with entry instances, then we have created distance between where the data structure is located or defined and where the methods that operate on the data structures are defined. We can also see that the readability isn't as high as on the right-hand side, or we can call it non-dry, dry standing for do not repeat yourself, because we have introduced the necessity here to repeat this entry parameter in our definition of length. On the right-hand side, where we introduce the length method into the entry class as an instance method, we have contextual proximity, meaning the data and the operations that process the data are very close together. We also have good readability. The code is dry, no unnecessary repetitions. We also gain scoping or namespacing because we can define length methods in any class we want. They never clash in their names. Whereas if we need multiple helper methods with the same name length, we would have to either put them into different modules or fiddle with their name to make them unique. But of course, we also have some downsides. We have dependency of the code on the concrete class. So when we write the code for the length function here or length method, we rely on our knowledge how to get to the attributes themselves, and therefore we have limited the ability to reuse this code. The decision which of these two options you choose is largely dependent on how you structure your application or also on taste. And sometimes it's very possible to start out with one and then move over to the other through a process we call refactoring. So in the IRB, we reopen the entry class and add the length method, summing up the headline.length and the body.length and end. So what I've done is I've added the length method to the existing entry class, which we've defined up here. And now for the existing entry E, I should be able to call the method length. And indeed, it returns 27 in this case.